Imagine discovering the person you love the most has a secret so dark, so unimaginable, that it shakes the very foundation of your life. For Prince Harry, that moment came not with whispers, not with rumors, but with pieces of evidence that refused to be ignored. Could it be true? Could the child he had been cradling, nurturing, and loving every day, the child who shared his eyes, his smile, his laughter, actually not be his? The very idea would make any father tremble. But Harry wasn't just any father. He was a prince, a public figure, someone who had devoted his life to protecting his family, both from public scrutiny and from personal betrayals. And now, the walls that had always kept his world intact were crumbling in ways he could never have predicted. It started with the dates, the little details that most people wouldn't even notice. A missed appointment here, an unusual flight there, a travel schedule that didn't align with the story he had been told. The dates didn't just raise an eyebrow. They screamed questions that Harry couldn't ignore. Every parent, every protective instinct, told him that something was off. And when he began cross-referencing timelines, piecing together snippets of information from private conversations, whispered confidences, and unaccounted for hours, the picture became impossible to dismiss. There was someone else in Meghan's orbit. Someone who had access to her. Someone who was always around when she was supposedly alone with him. A man entrusted with her safety, her security, her privacy. Someone Harry had relied on without question. And now, that trust was under threat. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You might be wondering, how could a father even begin to question his child's paternity without concrete proof? How does one navigate suspicion in a world where every step is scrutinized, every word dissected, and every gesture captured? For Harry, the process was agonizing. Every look at Archie, every moment of shared laughter, every tender interaction became tinged with doubt. Was the resemblance real, or had his mind been clouded by fear and betrayal? The child's smile, so familiar, suddenly became a puzzle. The moments of pure love, so abundant, suddenly came with a shadow. And yet, Harry couldn't let it go. Not when the evidence, the timeline, the distance, the secrets, was mounting in ways that defied coincidence. The bodyguard. That was the thread Harry could not ignore. The man who had been a fixture in Meghan's life, whose presence was always justified with duty, protection, and loyalty. He was supposed to be invisible, unnoticed, a silent protector in the background. But in those quiet moments, when the cameras were off and the world was oblivious, the bond between Meghan and the bodyguard began to reveal itself. It wasn't overt. It wasn't something that could be pointed out casually. But in the small gestures, the private glances, the unexplained absences, there was a pattern Harry recognized from the stories of countless betrayals he had heard about, but never imagined he would encounter himself. And so he began digging. Not recklessly, not with a public agenda, but with the careful precision of someone who knew the stakes were immense. Every flight log, every hotel booking, every event attended alone or in private became a piece of the puzzle. Harry traced Meghan's movements with the meticulousness of a detective, noting coincidences that felt less and less coincidental. And the more he discovered, the more he realized that the narrative he had been told, a narrative of trust, love, and family, was unraveling in front of his eyes. The palace, of course, remained a fortress of secrecy. The public would never know, the media would never have the full story, and even close family members were often kept in the dark. But Harry, in the privacy of his own thoughts and the limited circle of confidants he trusted, was piecing together a truth that no one else dared speak aloud. Each revelation brought a mixture of anger and sorrow, disbelief and clarity. How could someone he loved so deeply betray him in such a way? How could the person he trusted most risk shattering the very family he had fought to protect? And most importantly, what did this mean for Archie, the innocent child caught in the middle of secrets and lies he did not deserve? The emotional weight of such a realization is almost unbearable. Harry had always been someone who faced challenges head-on, whether in his military service, his charitable work, or his personal life under the relentless gaze of the world. But this was different. This was personal. This was a betrayal that cut through the heart, that demanded answers, that refused to be ignored. And yet, there was no simple solution, no clear path forward. How does a father reconcile love for his child with suspicions that threaten to tear that love apart? How does he confront a partner whose actions now seem clouded by deceit, without causing irreparable damage to everyone involved? These are the questions that haunted Harry day and night. And then came the private conversations, the whispers that confirmed what his mind had already begun to suspect. Observations from trusted aides, subtle admissions, and the inconsistencies in the stories he had been told all began to converge. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Harry began to voice thoughts he had never imagined he would articulate, doubts about Archie's paternity. The very notion of speaking such a thing aloud seemed sacrilegious, yet the weight of what he had discovered made it impossible to suppress. The resemblance, the timeline, the secrecy, it all formed a pattern too significant to ignore. Every father wants certainty about his child, and Harry's certainty had begun to falter. But here's the twist that will grip your attention. No DNA test has been publicly confirmed. None. All of this, the questioning, the suspicions, the anguish, exists in the shadow of uncertainty. And yet, the intensity of Harry's emotions, the depth of his heartbreak, and the scope of the betrayal are real. More than that, they are powerful enough to ripple through the family, the media, and the public consciousness. You might ask, how can such a story remain private in a world obsessed with royal scandal? The answer is simple: control. The palace, the inner circle, and Harry himself have worked tirelessly to contain the fallout. But secrets this explosive have a way of surfacing, and the world is watching, waiting, questioning. The stakes could not be higher. Harry is not just grappling with personal pain. He is navigating a labyrinth of family loyalty, public image, and parental responsibility. Every decision he makes has consequences that extend far beyond his immediate circle. Every revelation threatens to ignite media frenzy, fan speculation, and social media debates that could redefine public perception of the royals forever. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, there is a father who is determined to seek the truth, no matter how painful it may be. Imagine for a moment being in Harry's shoes. Imagine the late nights, the sleepless hours poring over travel records and personal messages. Imagine the quiet moments with Archie, filled with love and wonder, tinged with a shadow of uncertainty. Imagine confronting your deepest fears, questioning everything you thought you knew about your partner, your family, and yourself. And now imagine the moment when all the threads start to weave together, forming a tapestry of betrayal that cannot be ignored. How would you feel? What would you do? Could you protect the child you love while confronting a truth that threatens to destroy everything around you? And yet, despite all the uncertainty, Harry's resolve hardened. He knew he had to face this head-on, even if the consequences were devastating. He could not ignore the evidence, no matter how much he wished it would disappear. And as the pieces fell into place, the picture became clearer, the pattern undeniable, and the questions impossible to ignore. Harry had discovered truths that would forever change the way he viewed his family, his partner, and the very concept of trust itself. So here we stand at the precipice of a revelation so shocking, so dramatic, and so emotionally charged that it has already begun to ripple across the royal world. Prince Harry, a man known for his courage and his heart, has been forced to confront a betrayal that challenges everything he holds dear. The questions about Archie's paternity, the alleged affair, the private investigations, and the emotional fallout. These are not just stories for tabloids. They are the lived reality of a family in crisis, a father in anguish, and a world watching in stunned fascination. And as we begin to unravel this story, piece by piece, timeline by timeline, secret by secret, one question looms larger than all the rest. What did Harry discover next that would leave him questioning not just the past, but the very future of his family? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The first cracks appeared in the timeline, small enough that most people would have ignored them. A missed appointment here, a late-night flight there, a hotel stay that didn't appear on any official record. At first, Harry brushed it off. Everyone has scheduling conflicts. Everyone has lapses. But something inside him, something he couldn't name, something primal, told him this was different. His instincts, honed from years of experience in the military, in public life, and in navigating palace intrigues, whispered that these were not accidents. They were breadcrumbs. breadcrumbs that led somewhere he never wanted to go. It began with a simple cross-reference. Harry was reviewing Meghan's travel logs, carefully noting the dates she was away, the flights she took, the security details that were assigned to her. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly normal. On the surface, there were explanations for every absence. But when he layered the dates over Archie's conception window, discrepancies began to emerge. Days where Meghan was supposedly in London coincided with flights to other countries. Meetings she claimed to have attended alone now seemed impossible given travel time. The math didn't add up. And for a man who was precise, who trusted numbers and facts, that was all it took to plant a seed of doubt. Harry went deeper. He began reviewing social media, photos, and any public appearances, comparing them to flight logs and hotel reservations. He was meticulous, almost obsessively so. Every Instagram post, every tag, every seemingly innocuous photograph became a piece of evidence, a potential clue. And slowly, the pattern started to emerge. There were gaps. There were overlaps. There were instances where Meghan's explanations simply didn't match the reality. To anyone else, these might have seemed trivial, minor inconsistencies. But to Harry, they were signs of a story being carefully curated, a narrative that hid something far more serious. One day, while reviewing a set of hotel reservations from a trip to the countryside, Harry noticed a small detail that made his stomach turn. The bodyguard in question had been listed on the same booking, supposedly for security purposes. On paper, everything seemed legitimate. But the timing, during hours when Meghan was said to be attending a private family event, raised immediate red flags. Harry stared at the screen for what felt like hours, the numbers swimming in front of his eyes, the implications pressing down on his chest. Was it coincidence? Could it really be nothing? Every rational thought told him it was impossible. The more he looked, the more the coincidences piled up into a pattern that could no longer be ignored. As he dug, Harry began mapping out every known interaction between Meghan and the bodyguard. Every meeting, every private trip, every unscheduled outing was charted on a timeline that only he could see. And as he connected the dots, a chilling realization took hold. The timeline aligned in ways that were too precise to be accidental. The overlaps, the unaccounted hours, the private rendezvous, they all pointed to a truth he had been desperately trying to avoid. And the most shocking part? There was no public record, no hint, no leak that could have prepared him for what he was beginning to suspect. It was entirely private, entirely hidden, and entirely devastating. The emotional weight of this discovery was immediate and overwhelming. Harry felt his heart hammering, his stomach twisting with anxiety and anger. How could this be happening? How could the person he trusted most, the person he loved most, be capable of such secrecy? And yet, every piece of evidence seemed to confirm what his gut had been telling him from the very beginning. Doubt and disbelief wrestled within him. Part of him wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to coincidence. Another part, the part that had been betrayed before, knew the truth was staring him in the face. And that part refused to look away. The next step was methodical. Harry began documenting everything. Every discrepancy, every anomaly, every unexplained event was logged, categorized, and analyzed. He created charts, timelines, and side-by-side comparisons that painted a picture of a family life riddled with secrets. He reviewed conversations, text messages, and private notes with the intensity of a man searching for answers that could not wait. Each new discovery brought a surge of adrenaline and dread, a combination that made it impossible to focus on anything else. And then there were the physical cues. Harry began noticing subtle shifts in behavior, small details that in the past he might have overlooked. A look exchanged, a gesture repeated, a hesitation in speech. These were things that normal people would dismiss, but Harry, trained to observe, saw them as confirmation of the inconsistencies he had already identified. Every piece fit into the larger puzzle, painting a picture that was both horrifying and undeniable. The palace staff, of course, remained oblivious, or so it seemed. No one noticed the intensity of Harry's private investigations, the sleepless nights spent piecing together a narrative that everyone else assumed was complete and truthful. He moved quietly, meticulously, careful not to raise alarms or create suspicion. But inside, he was a storm of emotion, a mixture of anger, heartbreak, and determination. The timeline was no longer just a series of dates. It was a roadmap to a betrayal that threatened everything he had believed about his family and his life. As the days turned into nights and the nights into weeks, Harry began confronting the most painful question of all. What did this mean for Archie? Every father loves their child unconditionally, but what happens when the foundations of that love are shaken by doubt? Every moment spent holding Archie, laughing with him, teaching him, suddenly carried the weight of suspicion. Was this child truly his? Could he continue to love and protect without knowing the full truth? The emotional stakes could not have been higher. And yet, despite the pain, the heartbreak, and the uncertainty, Harry pressed on. He could not stop. Every new piece of information, every new inconsistency, demanded further investigation. The timeline had become his obsession, his driving force, the one thing he clung to in a world that suddenly felt unrecognizable. And as the pattern became clearer, as the dates, flights, and private meetings aligned into a narrative too precise to ignore, the reality of betrayal began to crystallize. The culmination of this chapter in Harry's life was both terrifying and inevitable. The timeline had revealed what he had feared, what he had suspected, and what he had hoped was not true. The pieces were there, laid out in meticulous detail, pointing to a truth that could no longer be ignored. Every rational thought, every instinct, every emotional response converged into a singular understanding. Something had happened during that time that altered everything he thought he knew. And then came the moment that would haunt him forever. A small detail, a flight log, a hotel check-in, a private dinner, the kind of insignificant event that no one would remember, made the timeline complete. The puzzle pieces fit together in a way that was undeniable. The dates, the absences, the secret meetings, they all told a story too clear to deny. Harry leaned back in his chair, heart pounding, mind racing. The implications were staggering. He had known something was wrong, but now he understood the full scope. And with that understanding came a crushing weight of grief, anger, and disbelief. What he realized next would set the stage for confrontations, confessions, and emotional fallout that no one could have anticipated. The timeline had spoken, and its message was unmistakable. Harry knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But what he discovered in the details, in the hours, in the secrets buried within the calendar of events, would change everything. And the truth was more shocking than anyone could imagine. He had always trusted him. The bodyguard. The man who stood silently in the background, whose presence was meant to provide safety, assurance, and peace of mind. He was supposed to be invisible, a shadow, a constant yet unnoticed protector. But now, in Harry's mind, that very presence had become a source of suspicion, a looming question mark that refused to be ignored. How could someone so close, so seemingly loyal, be tied to the chaos that had begun to unravel Harry's world? It started subtly. The bodyguard was always there when Meghan traveled, always by her side at events, always within a whispered distance, ready to act, to serve, to protect. But proximity, as Harry began to see, also meant opportunity. In those quiet hours, when cameras were off and the palace doors were closed, interactions took place that were shielded from the world's gaze. Small gestures, fleeting touches, private conversations, details that to the average observer would seem innocuous, mundane even. But to Harry, they became questions. Questions that demanded answers. Harry began tracing the bodyguard's movements as meticulously as he had traced Meghan's. Every travel log, every hotel stay, every dinner and private meeting was documented. And as he aligned these events with Meghan's absences, a pattern emerged. Days when Meghan was supposedly engaged in private time with family coincided with unexplained periods in which the bodyguard's presence overlapped in ways that could not be easily explained. The pieces of the puzzle began to form a picture that was impossible to dismiss. They were never truly apart. Not when it mattered. Not when the conception window for Archie aligned perfectly with these secret overlaps. The more Harry examined, the more his heart sank. There were private dinners booked under the guise of business meetings. Hotel reservations in which the rooms were adjacent, supposedly for security purposes. Late-night departures, seemingly innocent, but in context, deeply suspect. It was not just coincidence. It was pattern. And in the mind of someone who had trained to detect deception and read between the lines of human behavior, patterns did not lie. What made it worse was the nature of the relationship. The bodyguard was trusted implicitly, not only by Harry but by Meghan herself. He had access to personal spaces, private conversations, confidential information. He was someone whose role required discretion, loyalty, and invisibility. And yet, it was precisely this closeness that made the potential betrayal sting with such intensity. The man who should have been invisible had become an active player in a story of secrecy and duplicity. Every interaction Harry discovered raised new alarms, new questions, new suspicions. Physical evidence, of course, was scarce. There were no photographs, no videos, no direct confirmation, at least not that could be revealed publicly. But Harry relied on subtler cues, changes in behavior, the timing of interactions, the hidden patterns of communication. The bodyguard's schedule, previously assumed to be dictated entirely by duty, now appeared strategically aligned with Meghan's. Even minor shifts in departure times, pauses in conversation, or unexpected presence in certain locations took on a different, more sinister significance. Every detail contributed to a narrative Harry had not wanted to see, but could no longer ignore. And then there were the whispers. Staff members, aides, and palace insiders who had noticed odd behavior, strange timing, and private interactions began to surface in Harry's private investigations. Not overt gossip, not sensational claims, but subtle observations that, when pieced together, added weight to the growing suspicion. Comments about late-night conversations, unusual requests, and moments of unexplained privacy between Meghan and the bodyguard. All these whispers were small threads that, when woven together, began to reveal a tapestry of potential betrayal. Harry's emotional turmoil escalated as he processed these revelations. The bodyguard had been a constant presence, someone he had relied on implicitly for Meghan's safety, for the family's security. And now, the very man entrusted with protection seemed intertwined with the very situation that threatened to unravel Harry's world. Anger, disbelief, sorrow, all these emotions collided. How could someone so close, someone so trusted, play a role, even inadvertently, in a betrayal that cut to the core of family and fatherhood? And yet, the evidence, circumstantial, yet compelling, was undeniable. The tension escalated when Harry began analyzing specific overlaps. There were nights when Meghan's schedule appeared to conflict with documented security needs. The bodyguard's location logs matched these periods in ways that seemed far too convenient, too perfectly aligned with opportunities for private interactions. Harry, who had always believed in giving the benefit of the doubt, could no longer do so. The coincidences were piling up, and each one screamed a question that had no easy answer. Every father wants certainty. Every protector wants assurance that those he loves are safe and that trust is maintained. Harry's dual roles, as a father and a protector, were being challenged simultaneously. He had to reconcile his affection and trust for both Meghan and the bodyguard with a growing recognition that the closeness he once celebrated now appeared fraught with risk, secrecy, and possible betrayal. It was a tension he could not ignore. Every day, he felt it tightening around him like a vice, constricting every thought, every emotion, every interaction. And yet, he pressed forward. Harry continued to map interactions, document overlaps, and analyze behaviors. He cross-referenced travel schedules, private appointments, and public appearances. Each confirmed pattern, each overlap, each moment of unexplained proximity added weight to the theory he was beginning to fear was true. And every revelation left him struggling with the emotional and moral implications of what he was discovering. The climax of this chapter in Harry's private investigation came with a realization that struck him to the core. The bodyguard's presence, once a symbol of protection and loyalty, had become a lens through which the potential truth about Archie's conception had to be viewed. The man who was supposed to shield the family now represented the very shadow that threatened to engulf it. Every interaction, every private moment, every anomaly in the timeline pointed to a secret Harry could no longer ignore. And then came the most damning detail of all. A combination of travel records, hotel bookings, and private event attendance formed a sequence that, when laid side by side, was impossible to dismiss. The overlaps, the absences, the timing, They all converged in a way that demanded confrontation. Harry knew that what he had uncovered was not casual, not incidental, and certainly not something he could overlook. But here is where the tension escalates. Harry did not yet have public confirmation. There were no statements, no DNA tests, no leaks that could validate his worst fears. Everything existed in the realm of observation, pattern recognition, and instinct. And yet, the more he examined, the more the evidence seemed irrefutable. The Bodyguard connection was no longer a background detail. It was the key that unlocked a larger, more devastating truth. As Harry sat with this knowledge, he understood that the path forward would be treacherous. Confrontation was inevitable. Answers would have to be demanded. And yet, the emotional stakes could not have been higher. The man who had been trusted implicitly now represented a potential fracture in family, trust, and love. Every decision Harry would make from this point on carried the risk of heartbreak, scandal, and irreversible consequences. And so, the stage was set. The Bodyguard, once a figure of safety and loyalty, had become central to the mystery, a man whose proximity, access, and timing could not be ignored. Every clue, every pattern, every overlap pointed toward a truth that Harry could no longer postpone confronting. The emotional weight was crushing, the moral implications staggering, and the suspense unbearable. But what Harry discovered next, the details that would finally bring the suspicions out of the shadows and into stark, undeniable clarity, would change everything, and the fallout would ripple through the family in ways no one could have anticipated. The first time Harry truly felt it, that cold, gut-wrenching sensation of doubt, he tried to dismiss it. He wanted to tell himself it was impossible. After all, Meghan was the woman he loved, the mother of his child, the partner he had stood beside through scrutiny, pressure, and public judgment. And yet, every instinct, every small clue, every anomaly he had uncovered whispered the same chilling message. Something wasn't right. And it was one thing to notice a pattern or a timeline discrepancy. It was another entirely to feel it in your bones, to see it in the resemblance of your child, to notice how your mind refused to let go of a suspicion so devastating it could shatter a family. It started with Archie. Harry would look at his son and pause, not just in admiration, but in something more profound, something heavier. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting thought, a momentary hesitation. Archie's expressions, the shape of his face, the gestures, the little quirks, all of which had once felt like tiny reflections of himself, suddenly seemed off. Was it his imagination? Was he being paranoid? Harry tried to reason with himself, telling himself that a father's love can sometimes warp perception, that resemblance is fluid and subjective. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and once it had sprouted, it refused to be buried. The timeline and the Bodyguard's repeated presence during key periods were the logical components, the empirical evidence. But the first suspicion that shook Harry to his core was visceral. It was that unexplainable feeling that comes when intuition, backed by facts, refuses to be ignored. Harry started noticing moments he had previously dismissed. Archie's laughter mimicking certain expressions, the way he tilted his head, the way his hands moved, all gestures that seemed familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time. Each observation was a whisper in Harry's mind, a subtle confirmation that aligned with the troubling patterns he had meticulously documented. The internal conflict was immediate and suffocating. Harry had built his identity on loyalty, protection, and trust. His world had been constructed around the belief that family is sacred, that the bonds of love are unbreakable. And now, all of it was being tested. Every smile, every hug, every shared moment with Archie was now intertwined with the terrifying question: could the child he adored, the boy he had sworn to protect with every fiber of his being, truly be his? The emotional storm intensified when Harry reviewed photographs from Meghan's travels during Archie's conception window. Images that had once seemed innocuous now felt like puzzle pieces forming an unwanted image. The Bodyguard was present in multiple shots, often positioned subtly behind Meghan, always within range but never prominently. At the time, these images had seemed like security protocol, a protective necessity. But in context, with the timeline cross-referenced, each photo was a silent alarm, a visual whisper of secrets kept carefully out of sight. Harry began confiding in a very select circle of trusted aides, people who could handle the sensitivity and gravity of his suspicions. Conversations were hushed, deliberate, and cautious. He did not want rumors, leaks, or gossip. He wanted clarity. And in these private dialogues, the pieces began to fall further into place. Observations from those close to the couple, previously dismissed as trivial or minor, suddenly resonated with an eerie accuracy. The pattern was emerging not just from his investigations, but from corroborating insights that only strengthened his suspicions. Then came the moments that no amount of evidence could prepare him for. Behavioral anomalies, subtleties in Meghan's mannerisms, the way she moved or spoke in certain contexts, the way the bodyguard appeared whenever she was under pressure or scrutiny. Harry noticed things that others could not. The fleeting glances, the hushed conversations when doors were closed, the private schedules that seemed more than coincidence. His intuition, which had never failed him in critical moments of life, screamed louder than any timeline, louder than any log or photograph. Something was profoundly amiss. The psychological impact was immediate. Harry oscillated between anger, disbelief, and grief. There were nights when sleep eluded him entirely, when the weight of suspicion pressed so heavily upon his chest that he could barely breathe. He would wake, replaying conversations and analyzing every detail of Meghan's behavior, every travel schedule, every unexplained interaction. Was it paranoia? Or was it the culmination of undeniable patterns pointing to a truth he had long dreaded? As his suspicions solidified, Harry's mind began connecting seemingly unrelated dots. Stories he had once brushed aside, snippets of palace gossip, casual comments from aides, odd coincidences, all converged into a cohesive narrative. It was not just about missing dates or suspicious travel anymore. It was about intention, opportunity, and betrayal. Every action that had once seemed innocent now had a shadowed undertone, a weight that could not be ignored. The emotional stakes escalated as Harry considered the consequences of confronting these suspicions. To act prematurely could shatter families. To remain silent could erode trust and poison relationships from within. Every choice carried monumental risk. He had to navigate between love, responsibility, suspicion, and heartbreak. How does a man protect his child while grappling with doubts about paternity? How does he confront a partner whose actions now seemed clouded by secrecy without causing irreparable damage? These were not simple questions. They were moral labyrinths with no clear exit. But it wasn't just intellectual or emotional analysis that fueled Harry's journey. It was instinct, a visceral sense that things were amiss. Fathers often notice subtle cues in their children that others miss, the intangible echoes of resemblance or divergence. Harry could feel it in Archie, could see it in patterns that could not be easily explained. The realization was agonizing. The child he adored might not be entirely, biologically, his. And yet, love for Archie remained unconditional, complex, and undiminished, intertwined with fear, grief, and a desperate need for answers. In private moments, Harry began imagining conversations he would have with Meghan, confrontations, questions, pleas for truth. He anticipated denial, deflection, and perhaps anger. He considered the possibility that even if his suspicions were correct, confirmation would be elusive, hidden behind walls of secrecy, loyalty, and fear. And yet, the need to understand, to reconcile, and to protect his son was inescapable. The first suspicions had emerged, and once they did, there was no turning back. Every day brought new tensions. Every public appearance, every press interaction, every royal engagement became layered with internal conflict. Harry had to maintain composure while privately unraveling, balancing the facade of normalcy with the storm of uncertainty within. The duality was exhausting, painful, and isolating. Few could comprehend the complexity of a man confronting potential betrayal in the most personal sphere while simultaneously under global scrutiny. And then, one quiet evening, a private reflection crystallized everything Harry had been fearing. He was reviewing a series of events, dates, and interactions, mapping each one against Archie's conception window. A particular sequence of flights, hotel stays, and private meetings snapped into focus. The resemblance, the timing, the subtle cues, it all aligned. The first suspicion, once a whisper in the back of his mind, became a nearly unavoidable certainty. The man who had been trusted, the timeline that had been scrutinized, the private observations, all converged to form a stark, inescapable reality. The emotional crescendo was overwhelming. Harry felt grief, anger, and heartbreak in equal measure. He understood the implications of this revelation, the potential fracture it could create in his family, in his life, and in the world's perception of him. And yet, amidst the pain, there was clarity. For the first time, the pieces made sense. The dates, the patterns, the presence of the bodyguard, the subtle cues in Archie, they all fit together. But here is where the suspense tightens. Even with all the evidence, no public confirmation exists. No DNA test has been revealed. The world knows nothing. Only Harry, in private reflection, with painstaking analysis and emotional reckoning, grasps the full gravity of the situation. And the tension, the heartbreak, the moral dilemma, they are all his to bear. What Harry would do next, how he would confront the reality of his suspicions, and how it would affect everyone around him would unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The first suspicions had emerged, but the path from suspicion to truth was fraught with complexity, secrecy, and emotional peril. And what came next, the confrontation with undeniable evidence and the emotional fallout, would change everything forever. Once the seed of suspicion had taken root, Harry knew he could no longer wait, no longer hope that the inconsistencies, the odd timings, the bodyguard's constant presence were mere coincidences. Something was off, and the longer he ignored it, the more it festered in the quiet corners of his mind. He had always been a man of action. He had faced crises on battlefields, in public life, and in the intimate corridors of his family. And now, he was facing perhaps the most personal, most agonizing battle of all. The truth about his family, the truth about Archie, and the truth about a betrayal that had remained hidden under layers of secrecy. It began with careful documentation. Every flight, every hotel stay, every event attended, every private moment that could be traced back to the conception window of Archie, Harry began to map it all. He created spreadsheets, charts, and timelines that linked Meghan's movements with those of the bodyguard. Each entry was meticulous, noting hours, locations, and discrepancies. He wasn't working with certainty. He was working with suspicion, intuition, and evidence that, piece by piece, was forming an undeniable pattern. The investigation was private, intense, and consuming. Harry couldn't afford leaks, not yet. The public didn't need to know the depth of his suspicion, and the palace didn't need a scandal before he was ready. This was not a story for headlines or tabloids. This was a father seeking answers about the child he loved most. The stakes were monumental, and every misstep could ripple into devastation. He began cross-referencing travel logs with hotel bookings. Every scheduled event, every public engagement, every claimed appointment was examined under a microscope. He noted discrepancies, times that didn't align, locations that seemed impossible given travel constraints, unexplained absences during critical periods. And every time a new inconsistency surfaced, it wasn't dismissed. It was cataloged, scrutinized, and added to the growing mountain of evidence that suggested a truth he had long feared. Emails, messages, and private notes became his next focus. Harry meticulously examined any correspondence that could provide clarity. He read between the lines, noticing patterns, omissions, and subtle cues that hinted at hidden interactions. Each note, each message, each unexplained communication was a puzzle piece. And as he assembled them, the image that emerged was one of opportunity, secrecy, and betrayal. He also spoke, cautiously, with a few trusted aides. Not to confirm his suspicions, he wasn't ready, but to gather context, observe reactions, and see if others had noticed oddities. Some had. Some had observed subtle shifts in behavior, unusual requests, or private interactions that didn't align with public narratives. Their observations, previously insignificant, now took on new weight. Each testimony, each whispered insight, became a thread in a tapestry of growing suspicion. The bodyguard remained central to his investigation. Harry studied patterns of proximity, timing, and availability. The man's schedule seemed to intersect with Meghan's during critical moments, moments that corresponded with the conception window of Archie. At first, Harry resisted the implications, telling himself it could be explained by security needs or coincidence. But the evidence was piling up, and the coincidences were too precise, too consistent. Something was hidden in plain sight. Every discovery brought a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger flared, grief threatened to overwhelm him, and heartbreak twisted in his chest. How could someone he trusted, someone he loved, be part of a story that now cast shadows over the child he adored? And yet, even in the depths of doubt and sorrow, love remained. For Archie, for Meghan, for the family that had been constructed with care, Harry still wanted the best, even as he prepared for the worst. The secrecy of his investigation was isolating. Harry carried the weight alone, sharing only fragments with the few he trusted implicitly. Sleep became irregular. He was haunted by the patterns he had uncovered, replaying events and scrutinizing every interaction. Public appearances were a mask, a necessary performance to maintain stability, while privately, his mind was consumed with timelines, details, and the possibility of betrayal. During the investigation, Harry began noticing details he hadn't seen before. Small gestures, repeated phrases, moments of hesitation, they all added to the growing unease. It wasn't just timing or evidence anymore, it was behavior. Human behavior, subtle and telling, that can often reveal truths even the most careful lies attempt to hide. Every observation was catalogued, analyzed, and interpreted. Harry's meticulous nature ensured that no detail was overlooked, no anomaly dismissed. And then there were the moments of revelation, small yet significant. An offhand comment from an aide, a private note discovered in the archives, a travel record that contradicted a public statement. All of these accumulated, layering suspicion upon suspicion. The investigation, while painful, provided clarity. It revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The more he discovered, the more he understood, and the more urgent the need for answers became. Harry also considered the broader implications. This wasn't just about uncovering a secret. It was about protecting his son, protecting his family, and preserving his own integrity. Every action had consequences. If he acted too quickly, he risked scandal. If he waited too long, he risked complicity or further deceit. Every step in the investigation had to be measured, calculated, and discreet. Even in the midst of meticulous analysis, the emotional toll was staggering. Nights were sleepless, days consumed by anxiety and grief. Harry experienced moments of anger that seemed almost uncontrollable, alternating with periods of deep sorrow. The betrayal he suspected cut to the core of his identity as a father, a husband, and a prince. He was navigating uncharted territory, a labyrinth of secrecy, loyalty, and suspicion, with no clear exit in sight. And yet, for all the pain, there was resolve. Harry had faced danger before, both on the battlefield and in public life. He had confronted crises, managed media storms, and endured personal loss. But this was different. This was intimate, personal, and it demanded a different kind of courage. It required patience, observation, and relentless pursuit of the truth. He had to know, no matter the cost, no matter the fallout. By the time his secret investigations reached their first critical milestone, Harry had compiled a dossier that mapped every relevant event, interaction, and observation. It was not just a record, it was a narrative, a story that could no longer be ignored. And the story it told was one of proximity, opportunity, and potential betrayal. The evidence pointed in one direction, and it was becoming impossible to deny. But even as the dossier grew, so did the emotional complexity. Harry loved Archie. He loved Meghan. Yet he could not ignore what he had discovered. The investigation forced him to confront the most painful possibility, that the child he had nurtured and adored might not be entirely his. And in that realization, the weight of responsibility, love, and moral dilemma collided in a way that was almost unbearable. And then came the moment, quiet yet monumental, When the first concrete link emerged, something that connected the timeline, the behavior, and the bodyguard in a way that left no room for coincidence. It was subtle, almost innocuous in isolation, but when aligned with the rest of the investigation, it illuminated the shadow Harry had been trying to navigate. The truth, or at least a devastating approximation of it, was becoming undeniable. And what Harry decided to do next, the first steps toward confronting this hidden reality, would set in motion events that could not be contained, could not be ignored, and could not be undone. The secret investigations had begun, but the fallout, the confrontation, the emotional reckoning, and the unraveling of a family's private world was only just starting. But what he discovered next, hidden in the details and overlooked by everyone else, would push him to the edge and change everything. It's one thing to suspect betrayal in private, to wrestle alone with unsettling patterns, timelines, and coincidences. It's another to have the walls around you crack because those closest to you begin to notice. For Harry, the realization that his growing turmoil was visible to others was both alarming and validating. Suddenly, the private tension he had carried silently, with painstaking caution, was reflected back to him in the eyes, whispers, and behavior of friends, aides, and even family members. The very people he trusted now noticed the storm brewing within him, and they didn't know what to do about it. The first signs were subtle. A glance that lingered too long. A question asked too carefully. A sudden hesitance in conversation when his name was mentioned. Friends and confidants began to notice Harry's irregular schedule, the sleepless nights, the restless pacing, and the way he replayed conversations or examined details that would seem trivial to anyone else. They sensed his anxiety, the weight he carried, and the way he seemed simultaneously present and elsewhere, caught in a private, invisible conflict that they couldn't fully understand. Some confidants, those closest to the couple and most loyal to Harry, tried to probe gently. Casual questions, innocuous remarks, subtle observations, attempts to offer support without prying. Is everything all right? You seem distracted lately. Anything I can help with? But Harry, protective of both the investigation and the fragile balance of his family, would only answer partially, deflect, or remain silent. He was navigating a precarious line. He needed allies, yet he could not reveal suspicions that could ignite chaos prematurely. Yet, even in deflection, his behavior betrayed him. Friends began piecing together what Harry refused to articulate. The intensity with which he scrutinized every detail, the hours spent reviewing timelines and travel logs, the quiet, tense energy that seemed to follow him, all indicated something significant, something personal, something potentially catastrophic. They didn't yet know the full scope, but they could sense it, a tension that went beyond normal stress, beyond normal concern. Family members, too, began to notice. Harry was part of a world where appearances were meticulously curated and emotions often veiled, but cracks in the armor rarely went unnoticed. Siblings observed subtle changes, the quickened heartbeat in tense moments, the haunted look in his eyes during casual conversations, the brief flashes of anger that seemed out of proportion. To an untrained observer, these could have seemed minor, but to those who knew Harry intimately, they were warnings, signals that something profound, something deeply personal, was unfolding. The emotional burden of being observed while navigating private suspicion added another layer of strain. Harry felt exposed, though he hadn't revealed anything. Every glance, every whispered concern from a friend or family member reminded him that even in secrecy, human perception could detect unease. He began to weigh the risk of confiding in trusted allies versus maintaining complete discretion. One wrong word, one misplaced admission, and the delicate balance of secrecy and investigation could collapse entirely. And then came the moments that validated his private observations. A comment here, a look there, a hushed exchange in the corridor. It became apparent that others had started to notice patterns he himself had meticulously documented. They observed his private investigations, sensed the meticulous review of travel logs and communications, and recognized the strain that no ordinary family tension could produce. Harry's suspicions were beginning to ripple outward, even before he had acted on them. The emotional complexity of this period was staggering. On one hand, Harry felt validated. His intuition, his meticulous analysis, and his careful observation were not misplaced. There was truth in the dissonance he perceived. On the other hand, the visibility of his emotional state heightened vulnerability. The people closest to him could see the fracture forming within his world. Friends worried, aides speculated, family members whispered. And yet, the very attention magnified the pressure, forcing Harry to confront his suspicions even more directly. Some allies attempted to counsel him, offering advice, perspective, and reassurance. They urged caution, patience, and rational thought, reminding him of the dangers of jumping to conclusions, of acting on circumstantial evidence alone. But others, sensing the emotional urgency, encouraged him to confront the situation head-on. The conflicting counsel added tension. Harry had to balance advice, intuition, and emotional truth, all while protecting Archie and preserving the stability of his family. Subtle contradictions began to emerge as well. Friends reported small but telling incidents. Meghan's explanations for absences that seemed forced, minor inconsistencies in narratives, moments of defensiveness when questioned about trivial matters. Each report, each observation, layered upon Harry's growing dossier of suspicion. What might have seemed mundane to outsiders suddenly formed a pattern of concealment, a web of secrecy that Harry could no longer ignore. The psychological toll was enormous. Harry oscillated between private anguish and public composure. He had to navigate appearances while internally processing betrayal, doubt, and heartbreak. Every interaction, even casual ones with friends or family, was filtered through layers of suspicion and observation. Every smile, every handshake, every ordinary gesture was examined for meaning, intention, and implication. By the midpoint of this period, Harry's private and public worlds began to collide. Friends and family were noticing tension that could not be entirely concealed. Their concern added weight to his investigation, forcing him to prioritize both evidence gathering and the management of perception. He was simultaneously an investigator, a father, a public figure, and a man grappling with the unimaginable. The possibility that the child he adored might not be entirely his, and the person he trusted most might have betrayed him. And yet, the human element persisted. Despite the chaos, despite the suspicion and fear, there remained moments of tenderness, flashes of love, and glimpses of normalcy with Archie. These moments were bittersweet, suffused with awareness of the looming uncertainty. They reminded Harry of what was at stake. Not just proof or suspicion, but the safety, love, and stability of a child caught in the middle of secrets he could never have comprehended. Toward the end of this phase, a turning point emerged. Friends and family began to witness behavior too precise, too meticulous, and too tense to be dismissed. Private discussions about security protocols, travel arrangements, and personal schedules revealed a level of scrutiny that was unusual even for someone in Harry's position. The patterns he had observed privately were now visible externally, and the world closest to him could sense that something deeply personal and potentially explosive was unfolding. The tension reached a peak when an aide, speaking privately, whispered a concern that crystallized the gravity of Harry's situation. "You seem different. There's something you're carrying alone. I can see it in how you move, how you watch, how you react. It's serious." That simple observation, meant as guidance or support, carried the weight of confirmation. Others were noticing. The cracks in the armor could not be concealed. And the truth, whatever it might be, was inching closer to exposure. And in that realization, the stakes became brutally clear. The investigation could not remain private forever. Friends, family, and aides would need to be managed, emotions would need to be navigated, and the potential fallout for Archie, for Meghan, and for the family at large was unavoidable. Harry understood that the visibility of his turmoil was both a danger and a guide, a sign that action, confrontation, and resolution were imminent. But what came next, the confrontation, the private discoveries, and the emotional revelations, would push Harry into uncharted territory and set the stage for a reckoning that no one could have anticipated. Confrontation. Just the word alone carried a weight Harry could hardly bear. It was inevitable, yet terrifying. For weeks, he had buried himself in timelines, flight logs, hotel bookings, and whispered observations. Every detail, every anomaly, every unexplained moment had been cataloged, analyzed, and cross-referenced until the picture was impossible to ignore. The puzzle pieces no longer allowed for doubt. But facing Meghan directly, bringing the suspicions into the open, was a different kind of trial. It was not just a question of facts. It was a collision of love, trust, betrayal, and the raw, unfiltered human heart. Harry rehearsed the confrontation over and over in his mind. What would he say? How could he phrase questions without accusations? Could he even ask the questions without shattering the fragile dynamics of their family? And yet, every rehearsal, every mental preparation, only reinforced the certainty gnawing at him. This had to happen. The child he loved, the family he protected, and the truth that could no longer be contained demanded it. The day came, unremarkable in appearance, but seismic in significance. Harry and Meghan were alone in a private room, away from the cameras, away from the prying eyes of staff, aides, and the palace. The quiet was deceptive. Every tick of the clock, every creak in the floorboards, seemed amplified. Harry's heart pounded, adrenaline surged, and a mixture of anger, grief, and fear coalesced into a tension that was almost unbearable. He began gently, cautiously, probing with questions that were measured, careful, and indirect. "I've noticed some things," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "Travel schedules, hotel stays, there are gaps, inconsistencies. Can you help me understand them?" Meghan's response, calm yet measured, offered nothing substantial. Explanations were deflected, excuses offered, and denials carefully structured. Harry listened, noting every pause, every shift in tone, every hesitation. The first wave of doubt met resistance. Meghan maintained composure, projecting serenity and normalcy, but Harry's trained instincts detected the cracks. Micro-expressions, fleeting glances, subtle tension in her voice. All the cues he had learned to read in years of observation signaled something beneath the surface. He pressed further, following the anomalies, probing gently but persistently. "You were with him when?" Harry's question was quiet, almost whispered, but loaded with significance. His eyes searched hers, seeking truth. The answer was delivered with a practiced calm, but Harry sensed the subtle evasions. The timelines still didn't align. The explanations still fell short. And with each deflection, Harry's resolve strengthened. He was no longer seeking proof to confirm suspicion. He was seeking clarity to reconcile his love, his trust, and the staggering possibility of betrayal. The conversation escalated. Harry's voice remained steady, but the undercurrent of emotion, anger, heartbreak, disbelief, was palpable. He referenced travel logs, private meetings, and interactions that had been meticulously documented. He spoke of timelines, of coinciding absences, and of the patterns that could not be ignored. Every word was deliberate, every statement layered with both fact and intuition. He was careful not to accuse outright, but the weight of implication was impossible to miss. Meghan's reactions were telling. There were subtle shifts, tightening of the jaw, brief hesitation before responding, avoidance of direct eye contact, that Harry noticed immediately. Every micro-gesture, every small behavioral nuance reinforced the suspicion he had been carrying in silence. And yet, she remained composed, projecting confidence and control, as though the very suggestion of impropriety could be dismissed without consequence. The room was charged with tension, a clash of private truths and unspoken fears. Harry, despite the careful documentation and growing clarity of the timeline, felt the emotional impact acutely. This was more than a question of dates or travel. It was a confrontation with the possibility of a betrayal so intimate, so personal, that it threatened the very foundation of his family. His anger burned, his grief threatened to overwhelm, and yet he maintained composure, knowing that clarity required restraint as much as courage. As the conversation unfolded, Harry noticed the small confirmations that had eluded him until now. Slight hesitations, repeated justifications, and nuanced inconsistencies that hinted at what he feared. Each moment of subtle avoidance added weight to the growing realization that the trust he had placed in someone he loved unconditionally might have been exploited. And with each piece of confirmation, the emotional stakes intensified. He was confronting not just potential betrayal, but a truth that could irreversibly affect Archie, himself, and the intricate web of family and public life surrounding them. Despite the emotional intensity, Harry pressed on. He asked direct questions, carefully layered to extract truth without destroying the fragile threads of communication. "Can you help me understand why this happened?" he asked, his voice a mixture of sorrow and determination. "I need to know because it affects more than just us. It affects Archie. It affects everything." The weight of the question hung in the air. Silence followed. The pause was long, deliberate, and telling. Harry, trained to read nuance, sensed the gravity of the unspoken. And then, the most revealing moment came, not through words, but through a pattern of behavior and subtle admissions that could not be ignored. Small admissions, brief acknowledgments, subtle gestures, all of which were too minor to register to most. But for Harry, they confirmed suspicions that had been mounting for weeks. The pattern he had painstakingly documented, the timeline, the presence of the bodyguard, the overlaps, and the inconsistencies, all coalesced into an undeniable, though still privately contained, truth. The confrontation left Harry emotionally raw, yet resolute. He had asked the questions, laid out the evidence, and observed the reactions. He had navigated the delicate balance of accusation and inquiry, love and suspicion, all while maintaining the composure necessary to protect Archie and preserve the family unit. The emotional fallout was significant. Grief, anger, heartbreak, and confusion collided in ways that were almost unbearable. In the aftermath, Harry understood the stakes had shifted. No longer could he navigate suspicion privately. The confrontation had revealed truths that demanded further investigation, careful reflection, and a strategic path forward. The emotional intensity was unmatched. Trust had been shaken, love had been questioned, and the foundation of the family was trembling under the weight of potential betrayal. And yet, amidst the devastation, clarity had emerged. Harry's observations, the meticulously documented timeline, and the confrontation itself had aligned, pointing to a reality that could no longer be ignored. The betrayal, whether partial or total, was real enough to demand reckoning. And the path forward, whether confrontation, reconciliation, or private resolution, would be fraught with emotional, familial, and public consequences.